Welcome everybody to the Tripolitan. My name is Ra'fat Yamak. Today we will be going over Ali Ibn Al-Husayn, the biography of Ali Ibn Al-Husayn written by Abdullah Al-Rabbat. I'm extremely excited to have you on today, Abdullah. This is my first episode, the first episode of the Tripolitan, and I couldn't be happier to have you on today.
Same here. I'm glad to be on.
Great, thank you so much. I'm just curious, out of all the personalities, what inspired you to write about Ali ibn al-Husayn? And who is Ali ibn al-Husayn?
Well, the reasons that inspired me are pretty unique, as they would be for any person. As you may know, my family comes from Syria, and our region of the world generally has been plagued with some sectarian strife, namely a Sunni Shia divide that's been taking place for quite some time, and it's manifesting today in a brutal civil war. So in Syria right now, we're experiencing an interesting exchange between Tasannun and Tashayyu', live on the ground, and it includes an ideological exchange as well. And so, within the last 5-10 years, we observed a rise in Shia channels, Shia websites, Shia books being distributed in the Arab world, and so I caught that early on, and I just was interested in Tashayyu', generally speaking, being a Sunni Syrian from Damascus, and given my interest in hadith as well, it just meshed together, and this book was a byproduct. So that's a rough outline of why. We can get into the details,
Yeah, no, that's interesting, man. Honestly, I mean, it's interesting how you talked about your Syrian background because it's really not just Syria in general. It's really Bilad al-Sham, like even in Lebanon, where I'm originally from. You also have this rise of sectarianism that has, I think, sparked a lot of curiosity in people, whether Sunnis or Shias, kind of to better understand the other side, and to learn more about their theology, really. Anyways, like as I mentioned before, in previous calls with you, Ali ibn Hussein is such a fascinating personality to go into because there's barely any, I mean, from what I've seen at least in English, any books written about him from a Sunni perspective. Usually, you always have books written about the Alawiyin or the Alid family. It's usually written from Shi'i sources or from Oriental sources, but nothing from a Sunni Muslim perspective, from the English at least. Have you come across that by any chance when it comes to the Alid family from books or material from Sunni sources?
Well, you see, the reality of the matter is that this stems from a greater issue, which is I often get asked by Muslims, by Sunnis, and some Shias, believe it or not. They ask me, well, why don't Sunnis, on their pulpits mention Ahlul Bayt? Why don't they teach about the people from Ahlul Bayt and the notable figures? And the reality of the matter is, I this question underlines certain premises and assumptions about Ahlul Bayt. The real answer to your question is that people like Ali ibn al-Husayn and others from his descendants, they are outshined by people who had more knowledge recorded from them, who were more significant in history, and just played a greater role in the bigger picture. And so, for that reason, for example, if you look at how much ahadith, for example, Ali ibn Hussein transmitted and compare it to other people, you see that these people in reality are not as significant as it's being assumed by, for example, some of the Shia sects. Now, does it mean that they're not insignificant? No. It's just that these kinds of questions usually have this underlying premise, right? Which is, why aren't you doing this? Well, let's first assess his true status, and then we can talk about that.
Yeah, Ali ibn Hussein is still would be considered a tabi'i, for example. Correct.
Yeah. So Ali ibn Hussein is a tabi'i. He met several companions of the Prophet. He met Jabir ibn Abdullah. He met Ibn Abbas. His father, Al-Hussein, was a Sahabi as well, but very minor Sahabi. Um, so yeah, he's a tabi'i. He's a respectable, revered person in our sources, albeit not as revered as in in the Twelver theology or Ismaili
Right.
theology.
Right. Right. And in the Shi'i or in the Twelver theology, he would be considered the fourth Imam, correct?
So Twelvers and Ismailis, they consider Ali ibn Hussein to be the fourth Imam after Al-Hussein.
All right. And this is the Hussein we're talking about, the Hussein who was martyred in Karbala, correct? This is the Hussein, just to make it clear to the audience.
Yeah, so his father is Al-Hussein ibn Ali ibn Abi Talib, the son of Ali and the grandson of the Prophet,
Yeah.
martyred at Karbala. His
Right.
mother was a slave girl
Mm-hmm.
owned by Al-Hussein, concubine.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's pretty much the general background of this figure's life.
Yeah. Like I said, man, it was when I read the book, I was fascinated with so many things. And we're gonna briefly go over some of the chapters that you go over. One of the things that you wrote in the beginning that kind of was interesting to me was you described this biography as a biography of historical Ali, not theological Ali. Would you mind going into a little bit more detail what you mean by that between historical Ali and theological Ali?
Sure. So today, in the 21st century, or the 15th century Hijri, we have many different sects, schools, movements within Islam that share common ground, right? So let's compare, for example, Ahl Sunnah and 12er Shias.
Okay.
They have the common ground that, they believe in a man by the name of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They believe that he called to Tawheed, the Day of Judgment, fasting in Ramadan, that the Prophet should be obeyed and followed, that he migrated from Mecca to Medina. There's a lot of shared history that we agree upon, right?
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, our historiographies or our stories of the Prophet fundamentally diverge at various points in the Sirah, and that divergence continues after his death.
Yes.
And so we have different stories of the same events, different
Right.
retellings of the same historical events. And so what I mean by the historical Ali ibn Hussein is I'm attempting to discern his biography from the sources which I believe are the most reliable and most representative of his true life,
Mm-hmm.
the true historical figure, as opposed to the theological Hussein, Ali ibn Hussein, who is a caricature of the real figure in contemporary Shia sources and whatnot.
Okay, I see. Okay, that makes sense. Because going into theological Ali would probably require that's a whole nother book right there. Um, going into that kind of aspect. That's why I was kind of interested to see. Did you ever? I mean, so obviously, as Sunni Muslims, we look at the Bukhari and Muslim and we acknowledge their authenticity. Are there any hadiths in Shi'i books, like for example, like Kitab al-Kafi, that you find, based on, from your experience as a hadith student, reliable, or is it all of it just unreliable?
Oh boy, that's a big question.
Yeah.
Okay. So the thing with Shia sources is they diverge and converge with Sunni sources on different levels. So sometimes you'll find that it's like a Venn diagram, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
You have in the middle, you have sometimes shared traditions between both sects. So you'll find a hadith in Sunni sources that is ascribed to Abu Huraira, for example, relayed through Abu Huraira. And you'll find it in Al-Kafi ascribed to Ja'far al-Sadiq,
I
right?
see. Okay.
So it's a different isnad,
But the same
different
method.
transmission. Yeah, same
Okay.
matan. So that happens sometimes.
Okay.
At the same time, so that's one form where you do see the same traditions, albeit with differences, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, sometimes and this is not that common, but it happens. You'll find a tradition authentically ascribed to Ja'far al-Sadiq in our sources.
Mm-hmm.
And it'll also be ascribed to him in Shi'i sources.
Mm-hmm.
So this is, one of the few things that, as a Sunni, you can say, okay, this is something that is right. But it's not the predominant, form of traditions. And then you have pretty much everything else, which is stuff that is exclusively found in Shi'i sources. We're talking about fiqh positions. We're
Mm-hmm.
talking about theology, seerah, all kinds of things, metaphysics, fada'il,
Mm-hmm.
being ascribed to Ja'far al-Sadiq, where we do not find them being ascribed to him elsewhere in
Right.
Sunni sources and whatnot.
Okay.
So to summarize, the answer to your question, if I look
Hmm.
at Al-Kafi, most of the transmitters in it are unknown according to our standards,
Okay.
and you pretty much cannot verify anything in the book unless it's authentically relayed outside the book in our sources.
I see. Very interesting. Okay, so as I mentioned before, I loved reading the book. It was interesting. And there was a chapter about his upbringing, Ali's upbringing, and obviously then it goes on to that pivotal moment in his life, which is his father's death, Hussein ibn Ali. Based on your readings, and you touch upon this in your book as well, how do you think? I mean, obviously it's his father, but still, how was that moment when Hussein was slain in the battle? How did that affect Ali ibn Hussein, and how did it mold him to become the man that he became eventually?
Okay, so to take a step back, so what happened? For some people, might not know the actual story, so I'll give a brief summary.
Great.
What happened is that when Yazid became the caliph
Hmm.
after his father Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, Al-Husayn ibn Ali radiallahu anh did not want to be forced to be to pledge allegiance to Yazid. He felt it was humiliating, and so he fled to Mecca. So he was in Medina.
Hmm.
He fled to Mecca with his household and his family and everything, and he stayed in Medina. He stayed in Mecca for some time, several months.
Right.
And in Mecca, he met the Sahabi, junior Sahabi, Abdullah ibn Zubair.
Hmm.
And
Who has a whole story to himself as well.
yeah, that's a whole different story.
Yeah.
And he was telling him, I want to leave because I know that the Kaaba, essentially its sanctity, will be violated because of a man staying inside.
Hmm.
Right? I don't want to be that man.
Hmm.
And so Abdullah ibn Zubair suggests, why don't you go to Kufa? These are your father's supporters. Ali ibn Abi Talib's capital was in Kufa when he was the Khalifa. They're
Hmm.
your people, and they'll support you. And eventually, Ali actually went. Sorry, Hussein actually went.
Hmm.
Traveled from Mecca to Kufa, and he would receive letters from the people of Kufa inviting him prior to that. And so the Umayyads eventually realized what had happened, right? That there's a
Hmm.
mobilization taking place. This
Yep.
person is going to Kufa. And
Yep.
so they intercepted him outside the city of Kufa in a land called Karbala.
Hmm.
Okay? And what ended up happening is that a battle ended up taking place between Al Hussein and his very few descendants and relatives and a large Umayyad army that
Hmm.
was diverted. It was initially going to Ad-Daylam in northern Iran,
Hmm.
but they turned around and they realized, okay, let's confront Al-Hussein. He might revolt.
Right.
And so his father was slain on that day. Now, on that day, Ali ibn al-Hussein was around 24 years old,
Hmm.
according to the more reliable estimates.
Yeah, I saw there
Uh,
was some debate. Sorry to cut you off. I know there was some
yeah.
debate about that, how old he was when Hussein passed away. But it seems like 24 is the most reliable age.
Yeah, at least something in that range. Now, it might not
Okay.
be exact,
Right,
right?
right.
It may be 1 or 2 years off, or a bit more than that. But that's the general, estimate. And now several of his brothers died. So his older brother Ali.
Hmm.
So we have two Alis, two Ali
Hmm.
ibn al-Husains, right? You have Ali ibn Hussein al-Akbar and Ali ibn Hussein al-Asghar.
Right.
Al-Akbar died. He was killed. He was slain in the battle of Karbala with other brothers and relatives of Ali ibn al-Hussein. And Ali ibn al-Hussein al-Asghar, who is the subject of my biography, he survived.
Hmm.
Now, some sources like Al-Waqidi mentioned that he was sick on that day
Hmm.
and he hence did not partake in the battle and was spared.
Hmm.
I wasn't able to come across anything authentic about that can verify this claim.
Hmm.
But what we do know is that he survived for some reason, and it is possible that he was sick on that day and was spared.
Hmm.
So his family died, in front of him in a battle, and I mean, it clearly was traumatic, and they were transported. They were driven to Damascus after that,
Hmm.
back to Yazid, to
Right.
Yazid's capital, and
Right. And this and this
Ha-
this army was led by Ibn Ziyad, the one in Karbala. Right.
yeah, so you
Yeah.
have Ubaidullah ibn Ziyad, you have
Right.
Umar ibn Sa'd bin Abi Waqqas.
Yes. That's
Um,
honestly, that one really breaks my heart, man. The Umar ibn Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas. That one is that's a tough one to know that he
yeah,
partook in that.
well, subhanallah, it goes both ways, you know.
Right. Right.
There are, yani, Umar bin Sa'd bin Abi Waqqas, for example. I think Yahya bin Ma'in, the muhaddith, was asked about him.
Hmm.
Should hadith be written from him, or is he reliable? Something like that.
Yeah.
And Yahya bin Ma'in said, how can this killer of Al-Husayn be reliable?
Right.
Right? Now, of course, some muhaddithin still believe he's reliable as a transmitter. And that actually may be the case. You know, he might
Hmm.
be a reliable transmitter, but he clearly is condemned, and he was eventually slain for what he
Yes.
did with Al-Husayn, yani.
Hmm.
So, I mean, I don't know how it exactly shaped his character, because there's not a lot of detail surrounding, you know, these historical figures and their feelings and their psychology.
Right.
But
One.
yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but just one of the things that was interesting to me reading in the book, that he was one of the sole survivors from his household, and he was kind of trying to, I guess, I don't know, replenish his household. He was trying to, I think he had several
Mm.
concubines, and he got married several times just to kind of uh, compensate for the loss of so many of his relatives. I thought that was kind of interesting as well, that he made that like his mission after his family was slain in that way in Karbala.
So when it comes to the Prophet's descendants, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it pretty much is through two
Mm-hmm.
main people, right? His grandson Al Hassan ibn
Mm-hmm.
Ali ibn Abi Talib, and his grandson Al Hussein.
Mm-hmm.
Now Al Hassan had so many children, and a lot of them survived and had children, and so the lineages branch out pretty early
Right.
for Al Hassan. Lots of families, lots of descendants. Because of, however, for Al Hussein, because of the massacre at Karbala, there pretty much was a bottleneck.
Yep.
And the only surviving male descendant of Al Hussein is Ali ibn Al-Husayn, bin Ali ibn Abi Talib, the subject of my biography.
Mm-hmm.
And so all descendants of Al-Husayn today actually are descendants of this man.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when it comes to the lineage, in the book, I mentioned a report where Marwan ibn al-Hakam actually is the one who suggests it,
Yes.
right? Marwan ibn al-Hakam tells him, I see that your father's lineage has been severed. Why don't you, purchase concubines and father more children? And he tells him, I don't have money, and he lends him money essentially.
That's so interesting, man. It's that coming from Marwan ibn al-Hakam, yeah. It's just very interesting.
Yeah. Now, as for the authenticity of that report, it actually is not clearly authentic. But I
Yeah.
mentioned it because it's the only thing I found on that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for Marwan, it actually is interesting, right? Because if you look at Al Hassan and Al Hussein's life and Ali ibn Abi Talib's life, Marwan actually was pretty hostile to Al Hassan and Al Hussein. And I mentioned
Mm-hmm.
some of those reports in the beginning,
Mm-hmm.
right? About where
Yeah.
they're cursing each other, and Marwan is on the pulpit cursing Ali ibn Abi Talib,
Right. Right.
and exchange of insults between Al Hussein and Marwan. It's pretty bad. I mean, some of the accounts that you read are pretty extreme.
Yeah.
They clearly hated each other. Now, after Al Hussein's massacre, it seems like there was no more perceived threat, right? There's no fear that anymore of any power rising from Ahl al-Bayt after Al-Hassan and Al-Hussein were dead. And so you find the Zuhri, Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, saying that Ali ibn al-Hussein was one of the most beloved people to Marwan ibn al-Hakam from the Hashemiyin,
Hmm. Hmm.
right?
Interesting. Yeah.
And so it seems like they were not as they did not have a tense relationship. And interestingly enough, if you go to Sahih al-Bukhari and you look at Marwan ibn al-Hakam's reports in the book, they're actually transmitted through Ali ibn al-Husayn,
Okay.
right? So he transmitted things from him as well,
Mm-hmm.
um, which is interesting, nevertheless. But yeah.
No, definitely. I mean, like I said, I mean, Karbala is such a pivotal moment, pivotal historical event in Islamic history, and so many different sects emerged from it that initially it was just political differences, and then it morphed into theological differences. And you have a chapter where you discuss just Ali ibn Hussein. He was learning from different people, more learned people in the city, and this kind of goes against kind of the Shi'i narrative about how the imams, that they're ma'sumin or infallible, and that they can make tashri', introduce new religion after the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But it seems like even in Shi'i sources, it shows that they are deemed authentic. You mentioned that Ali ibn Hussein was sitting and learning from other. I can't recall the people that he was learning from, but more learned people, basically, which he acknowledged that they were more learned. Um, I thought that was pretty interesting to kind of see that even in Shi'i sources that they have that.
I'm not sure about the Shia sources for that one specific detail.
Mm,
Now you can infer that from traditions related to other imams, but I'm not sure I mentioned anything from Shia sources in that chapter.
okay.
But Ali ibn Hussein, according to the Sunni narrative, and the narrative which I believe is the historical narrative, is that he was a tabi'i, and he was surpassed by other people in knowledge, especially the companions of the Prophet. And so he learned from them, and he relayed things from them. And so, for example, one of his sources is Ibn Abbas,
Mm-hmm,
Abdullah ibn Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib. So he is the cousin of Ali's dad.
mm-hmm,
So he learned from his father's cousin. He learned from some mother, the Ummahat al-Mu'mineen, the Prophet's wives. He relates some things through them. He relates things from his father. He relates some things from a daughter of Abdullah bin Ja'far bin Abi Talib. So
mm-hmm,
that's he is his father's second cousin,
mm-hmm.
I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, so in the Shia narrative, as you mentioned, it's that these people received revelation from God directly, and that they inherited the knowledge from their forefathers. So there's no need for them to seek knowledge outside their household. And I mean, you could demonstrate that to be inaccurate when you look at his transmission and a more sober reading of his history.
Yeah, and I guess I think I misspoke before. I guess what I was trying to say is that there were Shi'i sources that spoke about him going against, let's say, like for example, like during the Mukhtar's revolt.
Yeah, yeah,
Ali ibn Hussein was heavily critical of Al-Mukhtar, even though Al-Mukhtar was claiming to act on behalf of Al-Bayt. Can you actually, just for the sake of the audience,
yeah.
can you kind of go over Mukhtar's revolt real quick?
Yeah, sure. Actually, it's actually a really interesting and really important pivotal point in history, especially in Shia history. So, what happened is after Al Hussein was slain in the year 61 after the Hijrah. I think in the year 65 or 66, I don't remember it off the top of my head, but a man in the city of Kufa by the name of Al Mukhtar bin Abi Ubaid al Thaqafi revolted,
Hmm.
and he assumed control over the city, and he started to kill and track down the individuals who were involved in the massacre at Karbala who killed Al Hussein.
Hmm.
Right? So one of the people he killed was Umar bin Sa'd bin Abi Waqqas that we
Hmm.
mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
He killed a bunch of other people, and sources mention that he would send their heads, their severed heads, to Ahl al-Bayt and Medina and other places.
Hmm.
Now, Al-Mukhtar al-Thaqafi, obviously, given what he did, it's not a surprise that he's perceived as a champion in
Hmm.
some Shi'i circles, right?
Hmm.
But in Sunni sources, you'll see that this man is condemned. There are traditions about him being a heretic, traditions about him claiming to receive divine revelation, and other weird, strange things. And hadith fabrication taking place and whatnot. There's all kinds of things about this guy. And a lot of 12ers today, if not the majority,
Hmm.
they actually have a positive perception of this man as someone who was martyred, fighting for Ahl Bayt and seeking their revenge.
Hmm.
But if you look deeper in some sources, you'll find that there are traditions ascribed to Ahlul Bayt where they are condemning this man who is ascribing himself to them.
Right.
And these traditions also exist in Sunni sources, and they're authentic, some of them. And some of them are authentic in 12-verse sources.
Yes.
And then you also have, quote unquote, authentic traditions in 12-verse sources where this man is being praised.
Mhm.
Right? And so you have some contradictions taking place, and but the man generally is revered today
Right.
by Tashayyu in general.
Where does because of this contradiction, and correct me if I misunderstood from the book, but sometimes that if there is a contradiction, like say for example Ali Ibn Al-Husayn's view of Al-Mukhtar, they say when he was critical it was like taqiyya at the time, like he didn't really mean it, and I kind of saw that like in the book, in the autobiography, like Ali Ibn Husayn being critical of that. Could you expand on that concept of taqiyya as well, and if I use it correctly when I was speaking about al-Mukhtar in specific?
Okay, so to answer that, I'll take a step back.
Okay.
Now, the Shia narrative surrounding Ahlul Bayt, specifically the 12 Imams like Al-Hasan, the ones after them, Al-Husayn, Ali ibn al-Husayn, Muhammad ibn Ali ibn al-Husayn, and Ja'far al-Sadiq, Musa al-Kadhim, all of them. They believe that these Imams were living under the jurisdiction of oppressive governments, oppressive Sunni governments. That's the narrative, at least. And so they believe that these Imams were pressured, and sometimes for their own safety, they would essentially not state their true beliefs, right? Or they would lie for their own safety to save their own life, to simulate their beliefs. And so that's called taqiyya in 12-verse Shiaism. And so this is more of a epistemological issue, but in Shia sources often, when you have contradicting traditions, one of the claims that can be cited to reconcile two contradicting traditions is to say that, okay, in the first tradition, the Imam was acting by taqiyya, he was lying for his own safety, and hence not representative of his true beliefs, and the other tradition is the real tradition, right? And so that's one of the cop-outs that you have with Al-Mukhtar. They'll say, well, Al-Mukhtar revolted, against, for example, the Umayyads, right? And they'll say Ali ibn al-Husayn was living, under Umayyad control. And so he couldn't have said anything else. He had to say that. He had to make that public statement condemning him. But in private, he may have, agreed with him and supported him.
Right.
So that's one position that would be held on this. Yeah.
It's very interesting. It's very, especially like, in this current age, taqiyya is thrown around a lot. But it's interesting to dissect that term from as a Muslim, to look into it within our tradition and within Shia tradition as well, so within Sunni and Shia tradition, and to see how the word is, they've really expanded. I feel like the Shias, when it comes to that word, they've really expanded on it. And you kind of mentioned the word cop out, because as you said, when there's two conflicting narratives, that's sometimes utilized as a reason as to why you have two different narratives or two different hadiths when it comes to the Shia texts. It's interesting to me to see it written from that perspective.
I mean, here's the thing. The concept of taqiyya, a rudimentary concept of taqiyya, does exist in Islam in general, right?
Sahih,
if you're about to suffer, immense harm, you can actually lie about your beliefs.
Like Ammar ibn Yasir's story, for example.
Yeah, pretty much. You can say something that's wrong even though you don't believe in it. But to transpose this idea of taqiyya onto the transmission of hadith, it's like, okay, it's like one day someone will cite a hadith for you. The analogous situation to that is, for Sunnis, is that someone would cite a hadith for you, and then there's another contradicting hadith, and will say, oh, here the Prophet was scared, and what he says is wrong. This is not what he actually believes.
Yeah.
And this is his true belief. Yani the transposition of this concept onto the the hadith sciences and
Yeah,
whatnot, that's a whole different kind of worms, yani,
yeah.
for another day.
It's a big can of worms. Honestly, that requires a whole other episode. But yeah, definitely, it's like I said, it's just interesting to kind of see it from that perspective.
So Rafat, let me ask you this question then.
Yeah.
What so before reading this book,
Hmm.
when you so what was your perception of Ali ibn al-Husayn? What did you go into the book holding, yani, in your imagination?
To be honest, I didn't know much about him. I knew that he was known as Zain al-Abidin, um, and I knew that he was a tabi'i, that he was a pious person, but that was about it. I didn't know too much from our text, from our sources, and I'm talking about Sunni Muslim sources. In terms of the Shia, I knew that he was the fourth Imam, that he was considered an infallible Imam, with the ability to do tashri'. But
Hmm.
besides that, I didn't know much, and I really couldn't. I think we talked about this before. There's a YouTube series called Maqatil al-Talibiyin, and but that's not from a Sunni Muslim source, from a Zaydi source. I think he told me last time. But I could never really find too much about the Alid family or the Alawi family from the Sunni Muslim perspective. But yeah, I didn't know much until I read your book. Definitely I learned much more.
The thing is, so the content that I mentioned in my book,
Yeah,
that's actually very little when you compare it to what we know about other people.
it's true.
You
You're right.
know, people like Abu Huraira, for example. I've been writing a biography of Abu Huraira for quite some time.
Oh,
It's like three
beautiful.
times. It's like three times the size in content.
And what's funny is Abu Huraira came like so much later after all the other Sahabas, yani. So, but he was such a transmitter of hadith. He was such a successful transmitter of hadith. He dedicated his life to that, which is why there's so much material about him.
Yeah, subhanallah, man. And the thing is, so when I get asked
Mm,
by Sunnis and Shias, why is it that Sunnis don't know anything about Ahlul Bayt?
yeah.
And there may be some truth to that, but the question is inaccurate
Hmm.
because it's not about Ahlul Bayt as much as it is about general ignorance in Islamic history, right?
Yes.
So for example, you're a Sunni Muslim, right?
Hmm.
Now I'm sure you've heard of a Sahabi called Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, right?
Hmm.
He's a pretty prolific companion of the Prophet, narrated a lot of things in our sources. Now, do you know his full name? His real name?
No.
Yeah, the average Sunni likely does not know this person's name, even though he's arguably more relevant than most figures from Ahlul Bayt in our sources. His name is Sa'ad ibn Malik.
Hmm.
He's a junior Sahabi from the Ansar,
Hmm.
who lived in Medina. And there's so many examples. It's like I was talking to a relative the other day,
Hmm.
and we're from Damascus, right? And
Yeah.
so the Sahabi that we know and have a connection to in Damascus is Abu Darda.
Oh, yes. Yes.
And so I asked this person, okay, from Damascus in my family, do you know
Hmm.
actually what Abu Darda's name is?
Yeah.
And he thought, for a
Sarah, I don't
couple
know
of
either.
minutes. Yeah, so his name is Uwaymir ibn Zayd,
Wow.
right? Like,
Awaymer. Okay.
yani, it's true that there is widespread ignorance about, Ahlul Bayt, for example, but it's just as true about any early Islamic figure in reality, right? And
Yeah.
and it's a symptom of a greater problem. It's not a Sunni Shia thing, and it has
Yeah.
nothing to do with that.
By the way, sorry, just Awaymer. Just the reason why I said wow, Awaymer is because there's an academic in the U.S. His name is, at first I used to pronounce it as Ovamir because that's how he spelt it, until I later realized his name is actually Awaymer. But it's a very rare name, but just yeah, it's interesting that name caught my attention.
So that's pretty much it. I mean, there's widespread ignorance and lack of awareness, regarding all early figures really in Islam. So if I were to tell you, Ya Rafat, do you know who Qatada ibn Di'ama is?
Lah, man, stop! I'm gonna
You would
fail.
not know, right? But this
Yeah,
person, Qatada, is a tabi'i.
right.
He's a tabi'i who relayed, according to some estimates, around 200 hadiths from Anas ibn Malik. Okay, that alone is more than all of Ahl al-Bayt,
Yep.
except, maybe Ibn Abbas and Ali ibn Abi Talib combined, and other
Right.
people. It's just like people just don't know. Yani, it's wrong to frame this on sectarian lines.
Right. No, it's a great point, man. It's honestly a great point, and at the end of the day, our religion is, it's built on merit. At the end of the day, right? Like the person who kind of contributed the most to Islam generally deserves more knowing about, right? I don't know if I'm making sense or not. So, just because someone is from Al Bayt doesn't mean he's more knowledgeable or more pious than say another person who's not from Al Bayt, but he contributed so much to Islam. I think the Al Bayt is kind of like a stamp that they kind of just put on, like, oh, you don't know him, then what's up? What's going on? You don't like Al Bayt? Oh, what's they just it's
So
like
here's the thing.
offensive when it comes to
Here's
that.
what's interesting. So this is actually one of the few areas where I actually believe that our culture has been influenced by tashayyu'.
Hmm.
Like, subhanAllah, this is actually where it gets a bit interesting. Tashayyu' in various regions of the Muslim world spread and declined at different points in history, right?
Yeah.
So there definitely was an exchange and influence, both ways, by the way.
Hmm.
And so you have, for example, in Egypt, the Fatimids ruled for quite some time, more than a century.
Right.
The Ismaili Fatimids. And there is an everlasting presence they have in Egyptian religious culture. It may be subtle, right? So, for example, a lot of the shrines that were built that exist in Egypt today,
Yeah.
like Ras al-Hussein,
Right.
right?
Right.
There's a shrine in Egypt dedicated to the head of al-Hussein.
Right.
All these were constructed by the Fatimids.
Not even that, by the way. And correct me if I'm wrong. Even Mawlid al-Nabawi, as far as I know, is a Fatimid invention.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what I read. I haven't searched that in detail, but that's what I've read and heard.
Yeah.
So there is an everlasting, influence, and it's understandable. It's not like weird.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
No,
and
definitely.
there's interesting stories you hear where there's a clash on the ground.
Yes.
So, for example, after the fall of the Fatimid Empire,
Hmm.
I remember reading a biography of a scholar once.
Hmm.
He and his students would go around the Egyptian countryside correcting the adhan.
Ah,
So,
subhanallah. Yeah.
the Ismaili adhan is similar to the 12-hour adhan. They
Hmm.
add a clause after Hayya al falah. They say
Hmm.
Hayya ala khair al amal.
صح. Yeah.
And it was widespread. It was widespread at that time, even if
Right.
the people may have not liked the government. So we have this. We have this in Syria. We have this in Lebanon.
Yeah.
In fact, if you look back in history, you'll find that some of the villages that are Sunni today are actually were Shi'i strongholds in the past,
Right.
and vice versa as well. And so there is an exchange of ideas, and Ahl al-Bayt is one of the things where we've not adopted the Shi'i paradigm, but our perception is skewed a bit because of the mere existence of the Shi'i paradigm,
Yes.
right?
Yep. No, 100%. It's interesting, and going back to what you were mentioning about the Fatimids and different, other Shia empires, Qaramita, Buwayhids, Dawla al-Hamadaniyya in northern Syria. It leads me. I mean, obviously, each of those empires were different Shia sects, and it was a spectrum in terms of their extremism. And that leads me to a word that also I saw that you mentioned in your book, and there was I think a significant portion, of the book towards the end of it was dealing with the term called Ghuluww. And how, just kind of going back to Ali Ibn Al-Husayn, how he dealt with Ghuluww Shia. So just before delving into that and seeing how he responded to it, what is Ghuluww exactly? And is it specific just to this context, or can it be applied to more than in different contexts as well?
The term ghulu is an interesting term,
Mm-hmm.
and it's actually used in the Quran,
Mm-hmm. So,
right?
yes.
So Allah addresses Ahl al-Kitab, لا تغلوا في دينكم غير الحق, right? Um, that's the one that can immediately come to my mind at the time. But ghuluw essentially is the exaggerated, excessive / unwarranted veneration or emphasis.
Mm-hmm.
Or emphasis. Emphasis maybe is a better word. So it
Okay.
can be in anything, right? Ghuluw can be in hating someone. It can be in loving someone. Ghuluw can be excessive praise. It can be excessive attachment to a place, to anything really.
I have a question.
Um,
Sorry to
mm,
cut you off. I just came to
sure.
my head. So, like when people say "Allahumma la taj'al fi qalbi ghillan lilladhina amanu," is ghillan from ghulu as well?
Wallahi, I'm not sure about that, to be honest.
Okay, yeah, I don't know. I have no
Um,
idea, but I just came to my head.
it may be that they have the same root words,
Yeah,
albeit
yeah,
they have
yeah,
different meanings. But yeah.
yeah. Okay.
So ghulu is a very interesting concept because it's relative, right?
Hmm.
So for example, a Sunni and a 12er Muslim today, they will agree that someone worshipping Ali ibn Abi Talib is ghulu. It's kufr,
Right,
right? We both agree it's ghulu. It's way off at the spectrum.
right.
Now at the same time, there is a spectrum between the Sunni and the Shia where certain things would be deemed ghulu and certain things would be deemed totally, sanctioned.
Yep.
So when I use the term ghulu in this book specifically, usually I'm using it in the context of excessive love, veneration, and exaggerating praise
Okay.
and beliefs surrounding this person and his nature. And so, I mean, as I said earlier, we believe he's a tabi'i, right? A normal tabi'i,
Yes.
pious person. But in 12er theology, he's believed to be a divinely inspired imam who has knowledge of the unseen given to him, and a lot of Shias believe he has control of the universe given to him, and he has legislative authority. So to us, this is ghulu, right? You're taking a normal person who's a good person, and you're adding these exaggerations and you're venerating him through that. So that would be ghulu, right?
Even the raj'a concept. This was uh, this was really interesting. You know, it reminds me of the raj'a is basically when some Shias say that Ali ibn Abi Talib is going to be resurrected with al Mahdi, right?
Mm.
They and I was reading that in your book, but it reminds me there was this one extreme Sufi group as well, which said that their mashayikh, that their grand sheikhs will, towards the end of time, will also rise, will resurrect with al Mahdi,
Uh,
and So I just thought that was pretty interesting how its origins are so it's going all the way back to Ali ibn al-Husayn. Imagine that's when these kind of ideas started floating.
this idea. Okay, so I'll just finish something important on ghulu, by the way.
Yeah, yeah,
Even within tashayyu', even within 12er Shi'ism, you have a spectrum.
right.
So for example, the famous Qummi muhaddith, I think his name is Muhammad ibn al-Hasan ibn al-Walid
Okay.
al-Qummi. He said, أول درجات الغلو نفي السهو عن الأئمة.
Hmm.
So the Qummi strand of 12er Shi'ism was very sensitive to ghulu.
Can you translate that,
Very.
Abdullah, for?
Oh yeah, forgot to translate it.
Yeah, no
So
worries.
what he said is the first degree of ghulu is to negate forgetfulness from the imams,
Hmm.
right? So the norm in 12er theology today is that they don't forget.
Hmm.
They don't they don't err. They don't make mistakes. They don't forget. They have knowledge of the unseen. And so you have a strand within Shia scholarship, albeit a marginalized one today, that said, well, the first steps towards ghulu is to actually believe that they don't forget,
Right.
which is aligned with the Sunni position in reality, on the matter.
Yes.
So there are spectrums or historical spectrums within Tashayyu'. Now, some have pretty much died out. Some are being resurrected today.
Hmm.
Um, but that's what when it comes to ghulu. Now,
Hmm.
Raj'a is a very strange belief. And actually is one of the earliest beliefs that emerged,
Hmm.
that began to characterize the Shia. So it really pretty much appeared after the death of Ali. Within a year after his death, people started to believe that he's going to come back.
It's insane, man. It's really insane.
And what's interesting is, yani, I've heard some say that it's more of a psychological phenomenon than it is a religious one,
Uh-huh.
right? So you have a group of people that have intense attachment to a person, right? And so
Yeah.
their knee jerk reaction to hearing him dying is saying, no, he's not dead. He's gonna come back.
Hmm.
And it happens throughout Shia history, by the way. You have a bunch of people where after they died,
Right.
people started denying that they died. It
Like the
really
12th
happened like a
Imam.
bunch of times. Well, I mean, 12 Imam is a bit different because there's debate whether he was born or not, right? And
Right,
they believe
right.
he's alive.
Okay.
But it happened with Ja'far al-Sadiq. It happened with Musa al-Kadhim. It
Hmm.
happened with Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiya. Totally
Hmm.
different Shi'i sect that emerged, the early Shi'i sect, al-Kaysanites. They
Okay.
believed he's alive and he's gonna come back. It's pretty common, this theme in Shia historiography.
Hmm.
So people started to believe that Ali is going to get resurrected, and the belief develops. By the way, so today in 12-hour theology, it's not just Ali who's going to be resurrected; it's the imams
Hmm.
and the pious, the good people, and then the evil are going to be resurrected. Right,
Hmm.
all the wicked are going to get resurrected, and justice will be sought from them in the dunya.
Right.
Um, right, and to a Muslim looking at this, it seems a bit weird. Well, I mean, they're
Yeah.
dead, and they're gonna get judged on the day of judgment, right? And
Right.
they're gonna be held accountable. So it's foreign to a Sunni, uh, you know, uh, conception of
Yeah.
Islam and whatnot.
It's
But yeah,
like I said, man. It's just insane to think that a year after Ali ibn Abi Talib's radiallahu anhu's death, that you would have something so crazy like that appear, even during the time of Al Hassan and during the time of Al Hussein, who were two pious people who would, and even Ali ibn Hussein, for example, he said like this is basically BS. Like we don't, no, that's not right, that's not true, and correct me if I'm wrong. I think is there anything in Shia sources that kind of indicate that as well, that him denying the Raj'a, or is that just in Sunni sources that we have?
Raj'a is a core tenet of 12-hour theology.
I see.
It is one of the fundamentals. Any tradition that you might find where they're denying it, assuming there are any, but I haven't
Hmm.
like studied that in depth, that aspect.
Hmm.
It's definitely not acceptable. This is a
Okay.
core doctrine. It's like you asking me about al-qadar, right?
Interesting.
So it's like asking a Muslim, like, are there reports where the belief of qadar is rejected by the Prophet, or salah, or
Yeah.
belief in the angels? This is
Yeah.
a core tenet of tashayyu'.
يعني معلومة من الدين بالضرورة يعني. There's no.
So it's من ضروريات المذهب, at least
Okay.
from the
Okay.
madhab. هلا
Okay.
for some they'll actually say من ضروريات الدين,
Hmm.
for some of these Shi'i doctrines, and they'll
Hmm.
deem other non-Shi'is non-Muslims, but that's all different debate.
Right. Right. Right.
But yeah.
No, it's very interesting. Like I said, reading through these, you know, uh, reading through the book and just seeing these terms, Raj'a and Ghuluww, and it's just fascinating to me, and it's fascinating to see how Ali ibn al-Husayn radiallahu anhu, how he really, he tried. It seems like from the source that he tried his very best to kind of dispel um this kind of talk, but it seemed like it was too big for him. Even it's continued to spread, and he and his progeny couldn't do much about it. It just continued to spread till today.
You have to bear in mind that a lot of these doctrines that we know today, that we observe, in different Islamic sects,
Yeah.
didn't fully develop by that, right?
Hmm.
So they're usually in more rudimentary forms, not as laid out, not as extreme, right? And with time, they just develop, and then they get rationalized, and then you have
Yeah.
scholars writing, treatises in the 5th century and the 4th century.
Yeah.
So what we see today may not have even existed or existed in a totally different form.
Yeah, and just to
Right?
clarify, I mean, because you mentioned the term you use is proto-Shia. You know, you
Yeah.
you you kind of use that term, so just to clarify that. Um, and just to kind of conclude, I'm looking at when I came to his death, there wasn't anything remarkable, nothing like his father. It seemed like he died a normal death, Ali ibn Hussein radiallahu anhu, just from old age. based on the sources I read in your biography.
Yeah, he died. He was younger than he didn't reach the age of 60.
Hmm.
Died in Medina. Pretty quiet, normal death.
Hmm.
Nothing really notable.
Hmm.
Just a normal life in Medina, pretty much.
And not to jump the gun, but then his son Zayd, from there you would have the Zaydi Shi'is, would emerge from Zayd ibn Ali ibn al-Husayn, correct?
Yeah, so he had a bunch of kids, right?
Yeah,
It's a pretty big list. I don't have
yeah.
them memorized off the top of my head.
Yeah, I saw them in
Uh,
the book, yeah.
so he has 6 daughters and I don't know
Yeah.
how many sons. One of them was Muhammad ibn Ali ibn al-Husayn, who
Hmm.
is Al-Baqir.
Okay.
So Al-Baqir is believed to be the fifth Imam by Twelvers and Ismailis.
Hmm.
He has another younger brother. His name is Zayd ibn Ali ibn al-Husayn,
Hmm.
right? And Zayd revolted in the city of Kufa against Umayyad authorities around the year 122, 121 Hijri.
Hmm.
He revolted, and so later the Zaydi Shi'i sect emerged and claimed or ascribed themselves to him. And then from their descendants, they're just branching out. There's a bunch of Shi'i sects. So, for example, after the death of Ja'far al-Sadiq, you have a bunch of sects branching out.
Hmm.
You have people that are al-Waqifa.
Hmm.
They paused. They did not believe there was an Imam after Ja'far. I just stopped at Ja'far.
Okay.
You have al-Fathiyya, believed in Abdullah Al-Aftah. You
Hmm.
have al-Qat'iyya, you have Twelvers who believed in Musa, who
Hmm.
later became the Twelvers, right? So they believed in this person as the Imam. And then you have people who believed in Ismail ibn Ja'far, Ismailis,
Right.
right? So
Right.
it really continues to branch off. Yani every single Imam dying is a pivotal point where new sects start to emerge and
Yeah,
branch out.
it's fascinating, man. Honestly, like even not even the imams. I mean, even during the Fatimids, and I think the Druze, they start venerating Al-Hakim bi Amrillah, who was a
Oh yeah.
Fatimi, ruler. So it starts even getting like even more, what's the word? Heterodox and just, you know, it's just interesting to see how it continues to just branch out more and more and more and more and more into these little tiny subsects, all that emerge from this political concept initially called Tashayyu.
You
Um,
know, interestingly, yeah, man, Druze are really interesting. Like everything about them, and Ismailis in general during the Fatimid reign, they actually eventually split into two sects.
mhm,
So Ismailis today are not one sect.
mhm.
You have Al Nizaris,
Right. Yeah.
Nizariya.
Yeah.
They are the Ismailis of Syria, for example. We have
Yeah.
in Salamiyya,
Mosyaf. Right. Mosyaf.
Masyaf,
Yeah.
Salamiyya,
Yeah.
their areas. So they're Nizari Ismailis.
Right.
You have some in India. They're called Agha Khanis today.
Right.
Agha Khan. And then you have
Aga Khanis are loaded, man. MashaAllah. Yeah. You ever seen
loaded
their
in what aspect?
and like monetary, like money, like funds? They're very well off.
Yeah, they have a united fund and they're pretty organized. So you have
Yeah.
Agha Khanis branching out from Nizar during the
Yep.
Fatimid reign. And then
Yep.
you have other Ismailis who believed in the Imam of Al-Musta'li Billah. And so they're called Al-Musta'liya.
Yep.
And so that would be the Ismailis that are called Bohra
Right.
Ismailis. You have the Ismailis in Yemen, in South Saudi
Right.
Arabia, Najran.
I'm telling you, man, this will never end. This
And,
will never end.
you know what's interesting though? We're actually
Yeah.
experiencing one right now, a new split.
Really?
So there is this new movement in the city of Basra in Iraq that
Okay.
is a 13er movement.
No way.
Yeah, it's pretty controversial.
Okay.
I
Wait,
think
is
his
it
name's
Sarahi? Or is that
لا لا
different? لا لا لا.
Sarkhi is 12er.
Okay, okay.
He's a traditional Shi'i guy, just some political, differences and
Differences.
whatnot.
Okay.
But no, you have Ahmad ibn al-Hasan, I think is his name, in Basra. He's
Mm-hmm.
now being claimed to be a descendant of the Imam, if I'm not mistaken, of Al-Mahdi. And there are 13ers today. Like, the Shi'i Marji'iyya is ferociously combating it.
Yeah.
They're responding to it, addressing their arguments. But who knows? Who knows? Like there are actual people here in the West that have converted to 13ism, been
That's
influenced by
interesting.
that. Yeah.
That's interesting. And just because since you mentioned Al-Mahdi, and since we're talking about Ali ibn Hussein, Al-Mahdi is going to come based on the hadith that we have in our Sunni sources. He will come from Al-Hasan, correct? Not through Al-Hussein. Or is there
You
kind
know,
of
there's actually nothing authentic from the Prophet about the Mahdi, except
okay,
two plausible traditions.
okay.
Um, and I mentioned this so many times because I always get asked about it, and
You're
it's
gonna
like,
you're gonna annoy a lot of people, man, right now.
the Mahdi. I've written about this in my book on the signs of the hour.
Okay.
The Mahdi. There's two plausible traditions about the Mahdi. One of them is a hadith from Abu Sa'id al-Khudri,
Hmm.
where he essentially says, uh, "The hour will not come until a man from my household, rules the land and fills it with justice and benevolence, just as it was filled with evil and tyranny."
Hmm.
That's it. Very, very vague and ambiguous hadith.
Hmm.
And then you have a tradition from Ibn Mas'ud, where he says the same thing as Abu Sa'id al-Khudri,
Hmm.
but he adds, it's added, details added, where he says that his name matches my name and his father's name matches my father's name. So Muhammad ibn Abdullah. Now
Okay.
that hadith is plausible. Some people weaken it, and some people authenticate it,
Hmm.
right? And
Hmm.
then everything else about the Mahdi is sayings of the Sahaba, very few sayings. Then you have most of the discussions about the Mahdi and the details and everything that's said about him
Hmm.
stems from the generation of the tabi'in,
Interesting.
pretty much.
Very interesting. Yeah, no, it's like I said, I was just curious because there's always that kind of I mean, I've heard from multiple people saying that because Al-Hasan, who would be the uncle of Ali ibn al-Husayn, because he was able to do peace
Yeah,
between two parties of Muslims, between Muawiyah and himself, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was going to bless him through his progeny, through his lineage, Al-Mahdi. But clearly that's not reliable, correct?
I've heard that. I've heard that, and
Okay.
what it most likely is, I haven't studied it in depth, but it most likely is
Yeah.
a saying of a tabi'i or someone after him.
Okay. Okay.
And subhanallah, man. I mean, you have people believing at one point that the Mahdi is gonna come from the descendants of Al Abbas,
Right.
right? So
Right.
it's not. We don't actually have as much information about this figure
Yes.
as people think, and rightfully so. I mean, he's given much more attention and
Mm.
significance than he really deserves.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
what the Mahdi is essentially is just a sign of the signs of the hour. He's gonna come and he's gonna do certain things, and that's it.
Yeah.
Like there's a bunch of ahadith like this. They don't
Right.
get as much attention as this figure that people attach to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, it's like I said. I mean, the Mahdi is it's always debated, and Muslims get very excited debating the Mahdi. But it's always good to go back to reliable hadith and to check with the sources. And sometimes things get a little bit lost here and there with people adding things here and subtracting things there. But like I said, it's always good to go back to scholars and people of knowledge to check up on that. Honestly, man, this discussion can go on for hours and hours, but I think we covered this book really well, alhamdulillah. Ali ibn al-Husayn, the biography written by Abdullah Al-Rabbat, was honestly a great book. Written, like I said, there is very few books in English written by Sunni Muslims about Alawi figures, people from Ali ibn Abi Talib's basically lineage, his children and grandchildren and great great grandchildren. So it's good to hear. It was very beneficial, and I recommend everybody to read it and to purchase it and read it. Because as Muslims, I think it's crucial to have a general idea of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ's household and know Al Bayt a little bit more, and to know it from a historical perspective, and make sure that all the material that we get are coming from reliable sources to the best that we can, inshallah. Abdullah, I want to thank you so much for coming on to my first episode. It's been great, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you and
Barakallah
reward
feek.
you. And I hope to see more books written from you, inshallah.
It's my pleasure. Inshallah, inshallah.
Allah يبارك فيك. Okay, السلام عليكم.
Ameen. Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.